My name's Annmarie Hordern. I'm Bloomberg Television Radio's Washington correspondent, and I'm so lucky to be joined by the authors of The Steal this afternoon. The Steal is a brand new book, The Attempt to Overturn the 2020 Election and the People Who Stopped It. And the authors are Mark Bowden and Matthew Teague. Mark is a correspondent for The Atlantic. He's a best-selling author. You might have read his book, Black Hawk Down. And Matthew, as well, have written for a number of publications, including The Atlantic, Esquire, National Geographic, and also a producer of one of his very famous essays in Esquire, The Friend. But gentlemen, I really want to get right down to the book. I finished it last night. What an amazing, detailed journey you take us on of these everyday Americans living in these 6 states. You do a ton of research, and this was all having to do with this overturning of, or the potential, the trying to overturn from the Republican Party or members of some of the Republican Party of the election. And 2 things really stand out to me. One is you really pull back the curtain of the very mundane events of government that normally we wouldn't notice. And the second is that this book was really all about Republicans, the Republicans who tried to overturn the election, Republicans who stood their ground in many of these states and saw the certification of the election. So let's start with the big picture of the machine of the government. There's a quote in here from Gabriel Sterling, who's the Republican chief operating officer of the Georgia Secretary of State. And he says, the whole point of government is you're not supposed to know it's there. The road is supposed to get paved. The election's supposed to come off. You're not supposed to have to think about it. But obviously, the whole point of prompted you for this book is you had no choice but to draw back that curtain. Was that surprising to you, these stories you found while you were doing that? And Mark, we can kick it off with you.
No, Annmarie, I wasn't surprised because, as you say, the effort to overturn the 2020 election was directed at the machinery of our election process. And elections in the United States are not held out of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. They're held in every neighborhood, every county of every state of the United States, and they're run by your neighbors and my neighbors and Matt's neighbors. So in order to understand how this effort played out, we had to go look on the ground in the 6 swing states at who were the people who were attacking the election, trying to overturn the count or the certification, and who were the people who were responsible for making that count honestly and for certifying it. And, that's where I think the real effort went. A lot of attention is focused on January 6th, but we feel that the more significant effort to subvert the election is what we document in The Steal.
And we're back. Sorry for the technical difficulties. It's a 3rd year we're going into in the pandemic, and still sometimes technology is failing us. Mark, please, can you pick up where you left off about pulling back that curtain of the mundane government we're not supposed to see, which you really shed to light in this book?
Yeah, I mean, the assault on the election took place primarily in the 6 swing states where the vote was close. And as the elections in the United States are not held out of a federal building in Washington, they're held in every neighborhood and community, every county all across the United States by your neighbors and my neighbors. So the real story, Matt and I felt, was what happened on the ground in these 6 swing states, in both on the side of those who were trying to overturn the count or block the certification of the vote.
And how did you go about finding these individuals? Matt, maybe you could speak to that, because you really learn who they are, that you learn some of their everyday habits, the granular detail of these everyday Americans that are either helping with the election or trying to watch the election and think that fraud is going on. How did you find these individuals?
Well, some of these people were thrust into prominence, even though they had been unknown previously. They were sort of hoovered up by the Trump campaign and thrust into the national conversation because they had complaints or suspicions or something that the Trump campaign found to be potentially useful. And some of them were just everyday people that we found in talking with people in the key states. And some we were working with a fantastic team of researchers who helped us find and identify interesting people.
The other surprise I have was that all the cast of characters, for the most part, are Republicans. Were you both shocked by that as well?
I was a little bit surprised. We didn't go into the project thinking that that would be what we would find, but it makes sense because, you know, the effort that was taking place at the local level was to put pressure on people to either falsify the election count or to refuse to certify it. And, you know, I think in many of those locations, because the vote was close, these elections are supervised and run by Republicans. And I think Republicans became particularly the target by Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani and others because they were considered to be vulnerable to either being talked into falsifying the results or bullied into doing so. And much to their credit, these efforts failed.
Matt, what do you think of that? Were you shocked as well?
I was surprised. I went into it honestly expecting to find this to be a red versus blue issue, that people would fall pretty cleanly along that line. But in reality, it was a matter of who had good information, who knew the facts. And usually when people understood the facts, they would hold to them, regardless of their political affiliation. And so instead of red versus blue, it became a difference of truth and lies. Which is a line that divides every human heart. And that gives me some hope in the future for America.
So many of these, their individual stories across these 6 states, but while you're talking to these people, researching them, following them around, what's the one thread you think that followed each of them, even though they were all over the map of the United States?
Well, I think that the thread is
Oh, I think we might have lost
different voices. The complaints or the allegations were, shall I continue or?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Continue.
Okay. It didn't really matter whether these complaints had any validity, whether they could be proved or disproved, just the fact that they were being made, because the idea was to generate such a cloud of suspicion around the election process that even reasonable people would begin to think, well, maybe there is something to this claim of fraud just because there are so many allegations.
Mark, did you find that common thread as well? What were the others of these individual cast of characters?
I'm sorry, was the question to me?
Oh, no, sorry. Matt, sorry, Matthew.
Well, one thread that I've sort of mentioned already is that it was really a matter of people holding fast to what they knew to be true. And an example of that comes to mind for me is Cheryl Guy, who was a county clerk in Antrim County, Michigan, a fairly remote county up in northern Michigan. And she is, as she would say, she's not a tech savvy person. And she was dealing with new computer technology to her. And she accidentally shifted about 3,000 votes from the Trump column on election night to the Biden column. And one of those votes was likely hers because she was a Trump supporter. And she realized her mistake within a few hours and came forward and said, I've made a mistake. It's human error. And I apologize. It's on me. But by then it had already been taken up by the effort to overturn the election. And so quickly there were private jets coming in the night, and people in Washington, like Rudy Giuliani tweeting about fraud in Antrim County, people coming into her office. They really turned her life upside down. And she, a lady who has worked for that county for her entire life since she graduated high school, is not going to run for re-election again as county clerk. And I think that she held fast to what she knew to be true, but there's a cost that comes with that too.
Yeah, Matt, I want to ask you, what is her life like now? Because when you talk about this in the book, it does seem like she's completely ostracized as well from her community. Is that still the case?
I don't know if it's still the case. I think hopefully it's died down a little bit, but it was really painful for her. There were people who she had known their entire lives, who had been neighbors and friends and churchgoers and acquaintances whose very birth certificate she had signed herself, who called her un-American, not patriotic, and much worse than that. So it was a really painful, difficult time. And I think things have settled down politically a little bit in Antrim County since then, but she's not going to run again.
Yeah, and we should note that she came forward immediately apologizing for this technical error she made and fixed it, felt terrible about it, but it still became this really tornado for her and her life. When you look at these characters, who gives you hope and who do you think the American system needs to worry about? Mark, we can start with you.
Well, Cheryl is certainly one of them. I mean, what all this pressure on her was to get her to say that she hadn't made a mistake, that the machines had switched the vote. This was the narrative that the Trump campaign was trying to promote. She knew that wasn't true. And much to her credit, she refused to change her story. The same is true of Clint Hickman, who was the chairman of the Board of Supervisors in Maricopa County, Arizona. Maricopa County is Phoenix, and it basically is 90% or more of the election in Arizona. So as goes Maricopa County, so goes Arizona. And Clint, as the president of the Board of Supervisors, was responsible for running the election in Maricopa County. And he was intimately familiar with the difficulties and the challenges and the methods by which they ran a fair and honest election. So on election night, Clint is a lifelong Republican and a Trump supporter. So he was shocked and disappointed when his own county and the state went for Joe Biden. But then he was even more shocked an hour later when Donald Trump came on television and specifically named Maricopa County as a place where the vote had been rigged, where the vote was fraudulent. Well, Clint knew that wasn't true. And he ended up, being the source of all kinds of attacks, protesters on his front lawn, people calling for his prosecution and execution as a criminal, calls from Donald Trump himself, trying to get him to alter the vote count. Clint, much to his credit, basically showed that the American people are not as dishonest as Donald Trump would like them to be.
Right. You both come on to this talk with a little bit of optimism for the future. Matt, what do you think this signals, all this research about, one, the midterms this year, and then the broader election in 2024? Do you think the system is ready for this again?
Well, I hope so. The people who tried to organize the theft of the election have had a practice run now. But the system has also had a practice run at standing up against that. And Mark mentioned the decentralization as a strength of our system, and that still holds true. It's not something in one building in Washington, D.C., where you can run in with a Viking helmet and claim to overthrow the election. It happens in your town and mine and counties all across the United States. That's still the case, and it's still our friends and neighbors who are running those elections. There are more worrying signs when it comes to the placement of election supervisors by the GOP, things like that. That could be a problem. However, it would be a short-term solution because in any representative system of government, the party that comes up with policies that appeals to the plurality of the voters will win in the end. So I think, it really will come down to ideas.
Mark, what is your thoughts going into the midterms and then presidential election 2024, knowing all of this granular details of how our election really works?
Well, as Matt said, I think that, despite these efforts by Trumpists to place people in responsible positions in places all over the country, it would be extraordinarily difficult to alter the count in a national election. You might succeed in an individual county even or a precinct, but I mean, there are just so many people involved. Most people are honest. Most people believe in the importance of an honest election count. So I just can't see the election itself being altered. I think the more vulnerable place is certification of the election. And there, I think we're seeing efforts in state legislatures all over the country, even though all of these efforts failed in 2020, to put people in positions where they can basically disavow or set aside the electoral vote and appoint their own slate of candidates. I don't think that would be terribly important in a congressional election, but in a national election with the president at the top of the ticket, that's a real threat. And I think it's something that Congress could act to safeguard.
Right, and Congress is talking about voting rights this week. And there's also, of course, the January 6th committee that is ongoing in their investigations, which are a lot of the reporting that they're looking at, you include in your book. Do you think their work, this committee, will be able to impact and safeguard our future elections?
Well, my hope is that it will. I mean, there are certain diehard supporters of Donald Trump who will just discard anything that this committee says. And already, we know that the Republicans in Congress have labeled it a purely partisan exercise. But I do think that the airing of the details of what happened, which we've done in our book, and which I think will be done on a national level during these hearings, will do a lot to make Americans understand exactly what happens. And I think fair-minded people will be fairly shocked and disillusioned by the Trump effort.
Matt, what do you think? Do you think the commission will ultimately be successful, given also the fact that it is up against a lot of or lack of cooperation thus far?
Well, the lack of cooperation is troubling, but I think that the American people will understand, hopefully, how to interpret that. There will be partisans, as Mark said. Some people will be so hardened in their stance that they won't be persuaded of anything. But I think that many, many Americans, when they hear the details, will be moved by facts. Maybe not completely, they may not abandon their party, but hopefully they will hold to the candidate who is most loyal to truth instead of the person.
I have a few seconds left. Just a quick question. When are we going to get the film?
So far, we have no indication that's going to happen, but it would make a very dramatic story, without a doubt. There's some great characters and some very heroic kind of profiles and courage that we document in this book, and I would love to see it get that wider audience.
Matt, you're the producer?
We'll see. I'll work on it. We'll see.
Okay, we'll see. All right. Thank you both so much for joining me, Mark Bowden and Matt Teague. I'm so sorry, Mark and Matt. You guys are a tongue twister. And their book, The Steal. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Annmarie.